It all started with a very simple idea. Tell the stories of how successful middle market CEOs made it to the corner office. I'm Brant Handley, founder and managing director of Resource Options International, or ROI. We're the USA's premier executive search firm focused exclusively on empowering middle market companies to attract, hire, and retain A players while transforming top executives' careers and lives. ROI's Into the Corner office is dedicated to discovering how middle market CEOs advance their career, and we're making these remarkable and sometimes quite unbelievable stories available to you for the very first time. Listen and learn about the challenges they've overcome, the interesting people they've met along the way, and the lessons learned that steered these executives' unique journey into a middle market corner office of their own. I know you enjoy these CEO stories as much as I've enjoyed recording them, so thank you for listening today. And if you like what you've heard, rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm looking forward to you joining me on the next great middle market CEO adventure into the corner office. Today, my guest is CEO Bram Kleppner. Bram has been Chief Executive Officer of Danforth Pewter since 2011 after joining as VP of Sales and Marketing in 2007. He successfully turned around what was a loss-making business and led the company to 7 straight years of growth and profitability. Under his direction, Danforth has expanded its network of company-owned retail stores and has enjoyed dramatic growth in its online business. Bram recently finished 5 years of service as co-chair of Vermont's Medicaid and Exchange Advisory Board, providing guidance on various aspects of healthcare policy to several state agencies, the governor, and the legislature. He earned his MBA from the University of Vermont and his BA from Middlebury College. Bram Kleppner, welcome into the corner office.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Great to have you. It's a bright New England morning. I hope you're enjoying the same weather up in Vermont as I am down here in Connecticut. And fall hasn't quite come, but it's wonderful to be able to kind of get to this part of the year. We enjoy the fall out here in New England, don't we?
Yeah, we sure do. Foliage is a pretty important tourist season for Vermont, and therefore a pretty important season for the retail stores that we have here in Vermont. So
I can imagine. As we were talking a little bit before the podcast, your career has pretty much been Vermont-based. So let's start a little bit with your early years. Where did you grow up? Are you originally from Vermont? And, what was your early family life like?
No, I'm not from Vermont, which is actually a pretty high hurdle to get over. There,
I can imagine. You're never quite a local, I imagine, right?
No, it's quite a few generations, I think it takes. But I was born in D.C. actually, and my parents were both teachers. And before I was born, they bought an old farmhouse in southern Vermont to use as a summer place. So, from the time I was born, I spent the school years in suburban Maryland and the summers kind of running around the hills and the woods of southern Vermont.
Beautiful. And was that pretty much all the way through high school and so forth, and lived in D.C. during that whole period before you went to college?
Pretty much. My father taught at the university level, so he did take advantage of sabbaticals and years of leave. So we did live, a year in Boulder, Colorado, and a year in Berkeley, California, and a year in Cambridge, England during that period. But kind of always home base was Maryland and summer base was Vermont.
Brothers and sisters?
I have one younger brother, a couple years younger than I am.
And did you guys both kind of, were you close enough to, kind of be that camaraderie that a lot of brothers have growing up and, Tweedledee and Tweedledum?
Yeah, we were really close when we were little. And he's a couple years younger than I am and much more athletically talented and probably smarter than I am too. So, at some point I found it irritating that my younger brother was beating me at all these sports. So there was a period of fairly intense sibling rivalry where we weren't as good friends. That lasted, I don't know, maybe from the time we were 8 to the time I was 8 to the time I was 14 or something, and then
very typical, huh?
The issues were all on my side, and I sorted them out, and we've been really best friends ever since.
That's awesome. And did he stay close to Vermont as well as he grew up?
He not as close. He went to Yale, and then he went to Cornell for grad school, and then he lived out in California for quite a few years, and then he lived in D.C. for a bit, and he's actually now back in New Haven, Connecticut.
Got it. All right. He's my neighbor now.
Yes.
So you mentioned your dad was a professor and your mom was a teacher as well. Did she teach at the university level?
During my lifetime, she mostly taught high school. She taught English in the Montgomery County public schools. She had been a university level philosophy teacher, um, but those days being those days when she had children in the mid '60s, that put an end to her university career.
That was a full-time job. Absolutely.
Yeah.
What kind of influences do you remember your parents having on you, particularly in those early years?
I would say their influences were not the least bit helpful for a business career, which is to say, they were both really intellectuals and kind of really believed in the life of the mind. And so we talked very hypothetically. We talked, we talked about ideas, and we talked about literature and that sort of thing, and not very practically. And certainly a career in the business world wasn't really something they had ever imagined for themselves. And they, I'd say, were very good about not pressuring my brother or me in sort of any way, kind of letting us find our own path. But I think just because from their sort of academic point of view, you know, career pressure, or academic pressure of one sort of another, I think sort of struck them as vulgar and not something one did.
Right. My dad was a PhD and taught at the elementary and then was an administrator. And yeah, the business career really wasn't kind of one of his top choices for me either. So I know what that was like. Did you have other influencers? Were there people that, kind of generated that idea for you in your life in the early days?
Just to tell one quick story about my father. My brother was talking to another guy, and it turned out this other guy's father was also a mathematician. And my brother said, "Man, tough having a mathematician for a dad, huh?" And the guy he was talking to said, "Yeah, like there's no one to teach you how to dress properly."
I love it.
It
That's
was true.
great.
But it's interesting because my father's father was a business person. He was he had an advertising agency in New York in the 50s and 60s, sort of very Mad Men. Um, but, he had been an immigrant. He was the first person in his family to go to college. And he, really saw education as the way to be successful in America. And so he had really pushed and led his children through the importance of education. And all three of his children ended up earning doctorates and going into academia. I'm not sure that was his intended outcome. I think he may have succeeded a little too well in his own mind at convincing his kids of the importance of education. But he was a fairly charismatic guy, and told great stories and was a raconteur. And I think kind of that may have sort of skipped my father, who was always a quiet, shy, modest, introspective guy, and landed on me a generation later.
You got the DNA, right? Well, what about your student life? Were you a good student in elementary, high school?
So I got good grades, as in elementary school, and sort of in everything except handwriting and behavior. And like I was good at math, I was not good at sitting still. Um, and I sort of would say I liked attention, and I liked telling stories and showing off and getting in trouble were sort of all ways to get attention. And I was like had been brought up in a very intellectual environment, so school was pretty easy for me. So I didn't have to put a great deal of effort into getting good grades in math and English and geography and history and all those things. And so kind of skated through with good grades in those subjects, but was not the teacher's favorite student by any means.
Well, you'd mentioned your younger brother was good in sports. Did you pursue sports as well? What, kinds of things did you do outside of class? Music, theater,
Yeah, so I ran competitively through junior high school, and college actually,
track, cross country, both?
both. Mostly cross country. I did track because it was a good way to start training in the spring for the following cross country season. But and I also skied and did a little bit of competitive skiing in high school, but took that up much more seriously as a competitive downhill skier in college.
And that was at Middlebury, right? Middlebury.
That was at Middlebury, yeah. And I like to say that I was the fastest skier on the team who went to high school south of the Mason-Dixon line, which
All right.
was a category that included exactly one person.
And then what about entrepreneurial things? Did your business interests take you to, the paper route at 10 years old, or selling Christmas cards door to door? What types of things did you pursue, if any, at a younger age?
Yeah, so in fact, I did start delivering newspapers pretty early on. Maybe fifth or sixth grade or something. I started delivering the Washington Post, and not very long thereafter, maybe age 14, started selling programs at University of Maryland football games, and pretty quickly graduated to selling Coke. And the interesting thing about selling, if you're selling programs, you took on no risk. They gave you the programs, and then you gave them their money. Um, Selling Coke, you took some risk. You had to buy the whole tray of Coke before you could sell it. So it was a very early lesson on the risk reward equation, because you could make a lot more. You could make a lot more money selling Cokes, but you had to lay out cash to get started.
You had to make the investment,
Yeah,
right?
you had to buy the inventory.
Right. Good lesson to learn.
And so learned that lesson, and also learned quite a bit about salesmanship, because you're walking up and down the steps in the stadium, and there are 20 other guys also walking up and down with Cokes, and they're all sort of saying, Coke here, get your Coke here. And there's an opportunity for real marketing differentiation. So, my buddy and I took great liberties with the classic script. And I recall on one particularly cold day, we stood up there as loud as and clear as could be, said, Coca-Cola, you've all heard it has cocaine in it. It will keep you warm today. And
I love it. I got a few smiles and probably made a few sales as well.
Got a few smiles, got a few sales, and had some fun. And no one ever yelled at us for us. The concession at the stadium. I don't know whether they heard about it or not, but we never got in trouble for that one. So
probably something you couldn't get away with these days. But times
no.
have changed.
Yeah,
not necessarily always for the better.
Exactly.
What about jobs? Did you work some part-time jobs in high school and college to kind of work your way through, or what type of things did you do early on?
So yeah, I had attended a day camp for a lot of years, and when I got to be 13, I became a counselor in training, and then when I got to be 14, I became a counselor. So I taught tennis at this day camp in the summers, and it was in Vermont near my family's summer place. So continued to live there and did that, and delivered newspapers all the way through high school. When I got into college, I did have an on-campus job. I worked at the God, what was it called back then? The computer center. Right before people had computers, you had to go to a place, and so I worked there doing kind of technical support and helping people who wanted to use the machines. And the summers during college did some working. Maybe the first year or two, I may have worked at that same summer camp, and did some adventuring in those summers as well.
And Middlebury, choosing that as a college, again, your love for Vermont, or was there specific reasons why you chose to go there?
Middlebury. So one, I loved Vermont, and it was in a part of Vermont I wasn't all that familiar with, different part from where I'd spent summers. and there's lots of good skiing nearby.
Let's get to the real reason now.
Yeah, exactly. Uh, and even then, it was a great school, and I must say it has gotten nothing but better since then. But even then, it was a really good school, and I was interested in sort of international politics, and was interested in I'd gotten um, over the years, sort of my love of skiing, and I'd spent a decent amount of time hiking as a kid as well in the summers, and that sort of combined to um, evolve. And as a kid, I had, for some reason, been sort of interested in the history of Arctic exploration, the dog sled explorers, and all that. That sort of all combined into an interest in sort of extreme cold weather sports and wilderness survival and winter camping and all that. And Middlebury offered lots of opportunities for sort of all of that sort of stuff as well.
How'd you settle on a major?
It was a little bit by accident. I majored in political science, which was something I was interested in, but I really became interested in philosophy, and it just turned out the best philosophy teacher at the school was in the political science department, kind of teaching Plato and Aristotle and political philosophy of that sort. So I ended up a poli sci major and studied that sort of thing.
And what was the first job you took out of college?
It was interesting because I took a couple of jobs simultaneously. And the thing that my sort of major occupation in those couple of years out of college, I was invited to join a team that was putting together a joint U.S., Canadian, Soviet Arctic expedition.
Oh, wow. Cool.
And, the idea was to raise awareness of the issues facing the Arctic and to do some research and to foster kind of trans-Arctic cooperation among the three countries that kind of have the big pieces of coastline on the Arctic Ocean. And it was a great project, and we went up to the Arctic and trained, and we had corporate sponsors, and Rossignol gave us skis, and we had all this gear, and it was great. And I actually took up the study of the Russian language as part of that, and but our kind of historic timing was a little bit off because as we got sort of a year and a half into it, the Soviet Union started to fall apart, and the Soviet side said, "Look, we've got bigger issues now than supporting this. We got to deal with our country, which is in collapse." And without the Soviets, there was sort of kind of no hook, no media interest, so no real reason for sponsors to be involved. So it ended up not happening. But it led to, it was interesting because it led to, by happenstance. And I'd say sort of the lesson looking back is following your passion can often lead to really rewarding work. Because I sort of found myself having gotten really excited about this expedition and having learned Russian and having gotten interested in the Soviet Arctic, going, gosh, what do I do now? And decided to see if I could figure out a way to go spend some time in the Soviet Arctic, even without this big expedition. And I was able to find, one way and another, a guy out in the middle of Siberia who had one of the early private enterprises in that town and thought that he could put an American to work profitably. So, he issued the invitation to get a visa, and I got a visa and packed a backpack and a duffel bag and got on an airplane. And this was 1991. Flew out to a city called Tomsk in the middle of Siberia, and spent and was really, as I said, I was there just to experience the Soviet Arctic and what Siberia was like, and to the culture and the language, and so I spent a year and a half living in Siberia, and had all kinds of remarkable adventures.
Oh, I can imagine. Wow. Wow.
But when I decided it was time to come back to the U.S., was now fluent in Russian and English, and didn't really have any particular geography or place to go. And I'd always thought that, having lived in southern Vermont and then having gone to school at Middlebury, that Burlington, Vermont seemed like a very attractive town to live in. So,
well, it's a town.
yeah, exactly. It's Vermont's only town by
Pretty much,
some
right,
people's
right.
lights. And so I moved back to Burlington, and at that time, had heard that Ben and Jerry's right around '92 was opening a joint venture in Russia.
Oh, cool.
And I called Ben and Jerry's up and said, "Hey, can I talk to whoever's working on your Russian project?" And got a hold of the guy and said, "Hey, listen, I love your ice cream.
Just spent a year and a half in Siberia.
uh, I'm fluent in Russian, so you should really give me a job."
That's a very compelling argument, Bram.
And it almost worked. Didn't quite, but
Oh no,
it
I
almost
believe
worked.
it.
The guy who was managing Ben and Jerry's joint venture and getting it up and running, who I talked to, said, "Listen, we don't have any expat positions in Russia. It's all staffed locally. And there's one job here in Vermont working on our Russian mission, and I'm doing it."
And that's me, right?
Yeah, exactly. So sorry. And I said, "Oh, well, that's too bad, but please keep me in mind if anything comes up, and let me know if I can help in any way." Um, and it just felt like it was meant to be somehow. So I poked around Ben and Jerry's, for any job I could find there, figuring I'd get a job in the company and work my way over into the Russian venture. Um, and there was really nothing available, other than in the retail store that Ben and Jerry's owned in Church Street. So I got a job scooping ice cream with my fancy Middlebury degree and my
And your
fluency in
Russian
Russian.
language.
Exactly. That actually worked. I spent a couple years working in the retail division, and kind of ended up pretty quickly managing one of the company-owned stores. And a couple years later, that guy called up and said, "Hey, I'm leaving the company. You should apply for my job." So I ended up taking over as the general manager of Ben and Jerry's joint venture in Russia.
Tell us a little bit about the first time you started managing people. Do you remember that?
I do. I was one of the leaders of the expedition, but it wasn't a formal employee employer relationship, or employee supervisor relationship. Um, so, the first formal time was at Ben and Jerry's, actually, when I moved from scooper to shift leader,
There you
and
go. Right. Had a
suddenly
team.
was managing the people that I had been peers with. And you know, I look back on it and think, it's a good thing that I'm kind of curious and like learning. And it's one of the pieces of advice I give to people who ask what's important in a career is to stay curious, and really develop an interest in really trying to understand how things are, and how they work and what's going on. Um, because I got interested in how to be an effective leader, and had lots of experience at being a bad leader early on in my career to
As we
grow
all.
out of. Yeah,
Any lessons from those early management experiences you could share?
absolutely. And I think one of the mistakes that I made was I thought that I was supposed to know everything and have every answer, and sort of wasn't smart enough to say I don't know when I didn't know. And it's so much a better answer than making something up that may be wrong, or
Right. Right.
or even maybe right, but you didn't know it. Right? And the other answer is I the other lesson from early on was um, the fact that you're not doing people a favor. You're not doing anyone a favor by being too indulgent of them in the workplace. Which is to say, um, letting people continue on in a position that they're not good at um, is not helping them out.
That's right. You're not doing them any favors.
No, I mean, if you're in a job that you're not good at, you're not good at it, and it's stressful every day, and uh, that, and sort of giving people second chances for certain things is absolutely appropriate. If they make a mistake, but if they do something outright wrong, like steal from the company, second chances are not appropriate. It's because it's not fair to everyone else at the company. So those are some early lessons learned.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Very key. What's the best or perhaps the worst lesson you've learned from previous bosses? And, you don't need to mention any names.
I had a couple of bosses who, well, one direct boss and one person who was several levels up, but not a direct boss. Um, who I learned a lot from because I could easily see myself ending up like them. Had some of the same instincts, and they were guys who just needed to show off how smart they were. And related to what I mentioned earlier, were utterly incapable of saying I don't know, and needed to talk all the time to show how smart they were, and therefore talked a lot and listened very little, and were not any good at listening. And as a result, the people that I worked with on the teams, um, we worked really hard, but it was for each other and for our customers. It was really in spite of the leadership we had, and not because of it.
No, I definitely hear that a lot, obviously, when we talk to CEOs. You spent a number of years at Ben and Jerry's, and did you move then to Danforth, your current position as CEO, or is there something in between?
There were a couple of things in between, and I was at Ben and Jerry's for 10 years, 7 prior to the Unilever acquisition, and 3 years afterwards. And had been thinking prior to the Unilever acquisition that I'd learned a lot, and my learning curve was sort of flattening out, and it might be time to move to some new opportunity and get challenged in a new way. When Unilever bought it, it suddenly seemed like there was a whole world of learning opportunities. At the time, Unilever was a $40 billion a year company with 240,000 employees, and it just felt like understanding how a company at that scale thinks about its businesses and about the future and about bringing products to market and so forth. So spent 3 more years working as part of Unilever.
That's a pretty long average, by the way, for someone who had been as long with the entrepreneurial side to stay on with the corporate. So there must have been something there you liked, right? In terms
Yeah,
of
I'll say to Unilever's great credit, they told us when they bought the company, "Don't let us screw you up. We're really good at, you know." They said we're really good at buying brands and screwing them up. Um,
well, there's honesty for you. Gotta love
yeah,
that.
absolutely. And they, for instance, and they've been really good about letting Ben and Jerry's stay pretty independent. Even to the extent of a couple years ago, while Unilever was spending quite a bit of money lobbying Congress against GMO labeling laws, they let Ben and Jerry's, their wholly owned subsidiary, lead the charge in favor of GMO labeling. Yeah, so to their great credit. So one, it was not a horrible night and day experience of going from the hippie commune that was Ben and Jerry's into working for Big Blue, right? It was a gentler transition, and there was a lot of interesting things to learn from a company of that size and scale and scope. After 3 years, I felt like I kind of understood how Unilever approached their businesses, and was ready to do something else. So I left Ben and Jerry's and Unilever, and was a partner in a startup, and this was in 2003, 2004. That was doing organic green tea based soft drinks, with the basic notion, to make soda good for you instead of bad for you somehow. And pretty early into the space. And I think, we had the products right and the brand right and had a lot of things right, but we screwed up a few things and the company grew quickly and then flamed out quickly. But as part of that, the COO that we hired for that business was someone who was a well-known entrepreneur in Vermont and had run a beverage business previously, and he and I became friends. And a little while later, he called me up and said, "Hey, I'm on the board of directors of Danforth Pewter down in Middlebury, and we're really looking to grow the business, and the CEO is looking to hire a VP of Sales and Marketing, and you should apply."
Oh, got it.
And
right.
this is someone whose advice and judgment I respect highly. So I applied for the job, and I understand he also called up the CEO and said, "Hey, this guy called Bram's going to apply for your VP of Sales job.
Make
You
sure
should
you give
interview
it to
him."
him.
I don't think he said that, but he did say you should interview him. Landed here in 2007 as VP of Sales and Marketing.
Oh, that's awesome. So you've been there over 11 years. Yeah, got it. So promoted to CEO in 11.
That's right.
How would you say your leadership styles evolved, particularly as you've made your way now to the corner office?
So a number of things, and it's an ongoing process. But I think the biggest thing now is that I've gotten very clear that I want the people on our leadership team who head the functional areas in the company, marketing and retail operations and finance and production, I want them to make their own decisions. And they don't need to come make a presentation to me or to the leadership team and get consensus. I ask them, and do the same for the big initiatives that I'm working on, to present the initiative to the group and take advantage of everybody's wisdom and experience, and to really hear and understand everybody's feedback. But in the end, it's their decision. And I also ask with big decisions, once they've made it, that they explain their thinking so that we can all learn from that. And also so that the people who were against whatever the decision was, who wanted a yes when the functional head decided no, or vice versa, understand their thinking, but also understand that their point of view was heard and was incorporated. It wasn't just ignored. And I think that's particularly important for me, that everyone understands that I've really heard their point of view and understood it and thoughtfully decided to do something different rather than unthoughtfully. So that's the biggest difference. That hands off, people make their own decisions, and we want to make sure that everybody's opinion is heard, and that we incorporate that so we make the best possible decision, and that we're able to explain clearly why we did what we did, but we make our own decisions.
Now you've been 7, I guess going on 8 years as CEO. What are your thoughts about building a company culture, Bram? And what role does a CEO play in that?
I think we started out, our company was founded in 1975 by two young artists, and much like Ben and Jerry's, companies that are started by a pair of hippies, tend to have pretty strong social values. And so that's always been a component, but treating every employee in accordance with our values. We often treat our customers and our community better than we treat each other and ourselves. So that's been a real focus, making sure that everybody feels that we're really living our values. And if we say we care about families, that we're fully supportive when someone needs to stay home with a sick kid or go to a kid's soccer game or whatever it may be, whatever they need to do. So we've really worked on that. So those are sort of general cultural things. I would also say that I've noticed over my career that the CEO's behavior has a big effect on company culture. And a CEO can leave and a new one can arrive, and the culture can feel very different in 60 days. So I'm, sort of careful to always make sure that I'm also conducting myself in accordance with our commitment to caring for each other and for our vendors and for our customers and for our communities and for the environment, making sure the company is taking those actions as well. And on a more specific level, um, it just doesn't take many people who are sort of negative and pessimistic, and like to complain to change the way the whole day feels or the way the whole office feels. And so we have, been moving more quickly to let people know that we really want people who look at everything that comes before us as a potential opportunity and not as a potential problem, and address it as something that's fun and positive and something that we can figure out how to make it a good thing, and instead of figuring out all the ways that it might go wrong.
I mentioned in reading your bio that you've really gone through a period of change. Back to growth and profitability. You've made some pretty exciting changes, and the company's electricity grid moving to 100% solar. You're doing some things with regards to zero fossil fuel usage. These feel like pretty significant changes. Did you have to kind of change the course of the company? Did that impact the culture? Was it more continuing kind of with those types of commitments to social change, but just doing things differently? Because, you don't turn around companies without changing a few things in the way that sounds like you did there.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I would say that one of my observations is that business leaders who have success tend to underestimate the role that luck played in their success. And I absolutely understand it, right? You're working really hard and you're grappling with these problems and you're making decisions and you're placing bets and things work and you have success. It absolutely feels like you did it, right? But the first year we got back to profitability, I wrote my annual report to the board and had a section on success factors. And I divided it into two columns. One is here's the stuff we did, and the other is here's the stuff we just got dumb lucky on. And the second column was much longer than the first.
Very humble of you.
But I have to say, like, there are all these things. For instance, our stores tend to be in drive markets where tourists drive. And, gasoline prices had stayed low, which made that possible for people to come visit our stores. And, we didn't have anything to do with that. It was just luck. And tin is a major component, and tin had stayed reasonably priced on the global market. And the weather around the holidays was perfect. There was a dusting of snow, just enough to put everyone in the holiday spirit, but not enough to mess up travel. On and on, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff that was just pure luck. And I would say our success over the past bunch of years has had, year after year, there have been a number of things that just broke our way, for things to work well. But the sort of bigger question of what did we have to change, and a lot of it is not a complete change of direction, but an acceleration. We've always had a commitment to the environment, and the technology and the money and things converged to a point where we could build a solar farm and we could do the financing with no cash out, and we could make it sort of all work. Um, and another part of it has been, there has been a cultural change that I alluded to a little bit earlier. And one of my guiding principles in finding business success is borrowed from a guy called Doug Hall, who runs a place called the Eureka Ranch.
I
And
used to work with Doug at Procter and Gamble, believe it or not.
there
I
you
know him
go.
well. Oh,
You
yeah.
know him well.
Oh, I know him well. We worked in the beverage division together. He's a great guy.
Yeah. So, his sort of mantra, fail fast, fail cheap, um, which is to say, uh, no matter how smart you are, the world is smarter. And, we can look at a dozen designs for holiday ornaments and say, oh, these three look like winners to us. Let's launch them. Um, but we're probably wrong. Those probably aren't the three best. And we're better off launching all 12 and in a year discontinuing the nine worst and keeping the three that our customers tell us are the three best.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So we've really worked hard to incorporate fail fast, fail cheap, and test as much as we can and let the world make the decisions, not prejudge ideas and not talk ourselves out of initiatives. If we can find a way to test it inexpensively without betting the whole farm on it, let's do that. And, that has really led us to test our way fairly carefully into the transformation of the company from being more than 90% wholesale to being 75 to 80% direct to consumer, either on our website or via Amazon or through our bricks and mortar stores. So that's been a transformation that we've kind of tested and felt and consciously worked our way into.
And higher margins with that too. I understand some of the profitability growth with that. That makes good sense. How many employees do you have now at Danforth, Bram?
So we have 75 permanent employees, and as we get into the holiday season, we will add temporary employees to our workshop and to our call center and to our retail stores. And actually, this year we're thinking we may nudge above 100 people on the payroll for the first time in our history.
And a pretty steady executive team, and the folks there, high retention rates. And companies that typically have that type of social consciousness tend to retain their people better. Do you experience that as well?
Yes. So we have on our leadership team, there are five of us. One person we recently hired, and I had mentioned moving the people who aren't sort of aligned with positively embracing change and growth into other positions. So we did have an opportunity to hire a new retail director in the spring. So he's a new addition. Our marketing director is now, I think, 4 years into her tenure. And the next most junior person is me, who's 11 years in.
Yeah, it tends to go pretty steep from there, I imagine.
Our production manager is 26 years in, and our VP of finance, and actually she's VP of everything. To be fair, she is 28 years in.
Wow, awesome, steady team.
They aren't by any means our only 20-year plus employees. We actually have a lot of long-term employees in our workshop as well.
What do you look for when you're making bets on the new people you bring into the organization that you plan to invest in?
I'm looking for above all sort of values and attitude. I want people who really care in the broader sense about the company and about the community and about the environment, who understand why we put resources towards those things. And I look for people who as I said earlier, see a potential project or a potential issue as a fun opportunity and not as a wearisome chore or a potential problem. And I think that's Those are the most important qualities.
Well, Bram Kleppner, you've been very, very generous with your time. We always have one final question we ask all the CEOs, and you've touched on a lot of this. So either you can make it a summary point, or if you've got some new, advice and wisdom, as we talked before the webinar started. Many of our listeners are folks, that are earlier in their career. They're looking at opportunities to grow into the C-suite, perhaps the corner office themselves, or perhaps doing things entrepreneurially, like you've done at parts of your career. What career and life advice would you give to those folks who, have their eyes on their own corner office?
So I'd say a few things. One is, as I said earlier, stay curious. Um, about everything, about the people you work with, about your customers, about your competitors, about the communities at large. The more you're sort of genuinely interested in those things, um, the more you will learn about them and the better positioned you'll be to be successful in meeting the needs of the people you work with and of your customers, and understanding where your competitors are and what they might do, and all those things. I used to work with a sales guy a sales leader who I thought had a great insight. He used to say, "No means either not today or not the way we presented it." And I thought that was really insightful, and I keep that in mind. Um, as I said, uh, don't talk yourself out of things. Let the world tell you whether it's a good idea or not, because the world's a lot smarter than we are. Work ethic matters. Being persistent, and somehow finding the right balance between being stubborn and being flexible. And I don't really have any good guidance on how one does that, except you've got to feel your way into it and develop your instincts. For people who want to become CEO, for a lot of people, kind of organizational politics is sort of a dirty phrase. Um, but I would say pay attention to the politics. And what I mean by that is, um, you know, and it's good advice, whether you want to move up in an organization or simply be effective in it, or simply um, be a kind human being, uh, is be sort of nice and considerate and courteous to everyone, um, and don't badmouth people behind their back, and so forth. And if you can truly put what's best for the organization ahead of what's best for yourself, um, I didn't mention this, but there was a point after a couple of years at Danforth where I walked into the CEO's office and said, "Listen, the company's losing money. It cannot afford both you and me. We have overlapping skill sets, so one of us should leave." And we talked through whose departure would be least disruptive, and decided that my departure at that point would be least disruptive. So I took the unusual career step of eliminating my position and laying myself off. Um, and 4 months later, that CEO got tapped by our governor to go be Secretary of Commerce. And he sort of called up and said, "You're right. The company doesn't need both of us,
Now I'm leaving.
but it does need one of us, and I'm not going to be here anymore. So you need to come back and take over the CEO position." Um, so I think to that extent, and I'd say
Be
also
honest
that,
with yourself as well as with others, really, huh?
yeah, absolutely. And the last thing I'd say is that I mentioned earlier, sort of the learning the lesson that you don't need to know everything, and that it's okay to say I don't know. As I worked with my team and the culture here, my goal was to arrive at a culture where everyone felt enough trust and they felt safe enough so that everyone would feel comfortable saying any of these five phrases. I don't know is number one. I need help is number two. I failed is number three. I screwed up as number 4, and I'm scared as number 5. And I really feel if you get to a point where people feel totally safe saying those things, then you can solve problems a lot faster and make a lot more progress and create a company where everyone who works there is really proud to work there and will, absolutely give you absolutely their best, the best they have of themselves to help the company succeed.
Well, that's fantastic. Once again, Bram Kleppner, thank you so much for your sharing your journey into the corner office.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me to join you.
Thank you for listening to Into the Corner Office with Brant Hanley. We hope you enjoyed hearing our guest CEO story as much as we did. If you want to hear more CEOs reveal their journey into the corner office, please subscribe via iTunes and tell your friends and colleagues. For more information about Brant, Resource Options International, and the mighty middle market, visit www.goforroi.com. We look forward to having you join us for our next episode.